Hello and welcome into another episode of Lockdown Wolves. Today on the show, Dereck Lively of the Dallas Mavericks did his best Anthony Edwards impression. And guess what that means? We'll talk about it here in a minute. Rudy Gobert comments off the rails. Once again, people talking about Rudy. We'll get into that. I also want to talk about the Tim Connelly interview that he did with Darren Wolfson at KSTP, Channel 5 and Score North in the Twin Cities. Some comments on several things, including the bench, backup point guard spot, the 15th roster spot, etc. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy hump day. Hopefully you're having a fantastic weekend so far. Today on the show, a lot to get to, and I want to spend some time talking about Dereck Lively doing his best Anthony Edwards impression. What I mean by that is making some comments in the media that are, I'll call them ignorant, maybe even ill-informed. Ant did that recently. We talked about it a little bit last week. We'll get into that a bit. I also want to talk about the Tim Connelly interview that he did with Darren Wolfson and lots that he covered. So I want to dig in on a couple of things that I thought were pretty significant. So with all that here on the show today, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So let's go ahead and get into the Dereck Lively comments. And if you missed those, I'll read a couple of quotes here. So this is on Dereck Lively was on, let's see, whose show was it? It's he was having a conversation with Theo Pinson, former Dallas Mavericks guard. In the interview, they were talking about players who get playing time. So this is Theo Pinson, a former kind of fringy NBA player, interviewing a guy who has 1 year experience in Dereck Lively, coming off his rookie year, talking about guys who are playing because of their contract. Is the conversation like this? Player X is playing just because he's getting paid so much money. Well, in this case, player X, they decided to call out Rudy Gobert. Pinson said, perfect example. This is a quote as transcribed on HoopSype and then also various places on Twitter as well. He says, perfect example. The Mavs play the Minnesota Timberwolves. There's zero reason Rudy Gobert should have been on the court. Lively says zero. Pinson says, but you're paying him $40 million. You better get out there and figure it the F out. And Lively says, and he didn't. Okay, I get it. Let's start here. Dereck Lively dunked kind of sort of over Rudy Gobert. I get it. That happened, yeah. Dereck Lively was really good. He was a huge part of Dallas's run to the finals. There's no question about it. That is true. And yes, Rudy Gobert struggled in that series. The Timberwolves did not do him any favors with the scheme that they were playing. We talked about that plenty. But the Dereck, calling Rudy Gobert out because of him supposedly playing because of his contract is completely erroneous. He's not only playing because of his contract. They're not a better team with Rudy Gobert off the floor. We've talked about this at length. The on-off numbers don't suggest that at all. There's a reason, the most obvious comeback there's a reason Rudy Gobert has won 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards. It wasn't a fluky one-time thing. It wasn't like 1 year his team was dominant. He led the league in blocks, and now he's just a Defensive Player of the Year. It's not that simple. Every single year except one, he has been on a top 10 defense in his NBA career. I'm taking out his rookie year. So take out his rookie year when he barely played. There's one other year, I think the Jazz, were 11th or 12th in the West, or 11th or 12th in the NBA, excuse me. Every other season, including Rudy's first with the Timberwolves when Minnesota was 10th, they were a top 10 defensive unit. Utah for the first, 8 years of his career, and then the last 2 in Minnesota. That's not fluky. And as much fun as so many people in the NBA are having with apparently piling on Rudy Gobert for no reason, and of course the Olympics did not help, it's still happening because people in the media are like, all right, this is an easy one. I know I can get somebody to jump off sides on Rudy Gobert because guys don't care. The other one that was perhaps even sillier because Dereck Lively is like 19. It's the Ant syndrome, right? The Dwight Howard comments on Gilbert Arenas' podcast were even more ignorant. Dwight Howard said he says, quote, I don't think he, meaning Rudy Gobert, deserved those defensive player of the years like he got them. I feel like he's a great team defender, but for what he did to get those defensive player of the years, I don't see it. I don't see him being an elite defender. He also said, when you're 7'2" and you're playing with athletic guys, you don't have to do nothing but clean up their mistakes or just being big in the paint, is what Howard said. That's worse because here's the thing. It's not that simple. There's a lot of guys that have played that are 7'2", like dozens of guys that are over 7 feet tall that have played in this league that have had a fraction of the impact or in fact a negative impact on their team's defense that are not Rudy Gobert. It's not that simple. And the part that's even crazier is go look at those Utah Jazz teams that Rudy Gobert won Defensive Player of the Year on. They didn't have all defensive team guys. In fact, I should have looked this up. I'm pretty confident all 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards that Rudy Gobert won with the Utah Jazz did not have another all-defensive team player on them. Of course, Jaden McDaniels got second team All-NBA, all-defensive team this year, and Ant got some votes. But those Rudy Utah teams, it's not like you had like Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman on those teams. You didn't have Gary Payton on those teams. You didn't have, insert, like he didn't play with Marcus Smart. He didn't play with another fantastic perimeter defender. He was playing with like older Mike Conley, and Royce O'Neal was the best defensive perimeter player they had on the most recent. He's played with Donovan Mitchell and Joe Ingles, and even some of those other like Gordon Hayward was a decent defender for a brief period in time, but he was, by the end of his Jazz term, he wasn't a plus defender. Like he wasn't playing with shutdown wing defenders. So the comment of that Dwight Howard makes, when you're playing with athletic guys, you don't have to do nothing but clean up their mistakes. First of all, it's wrong. But if he's just talking about this year with the Wolves, what about his other 3 that he won with Utah? And Jaden McDaniels was on the Timberwolves 3 years ago, and Rudy Gobert wasn't. And this was not a good defensive team. So was Anthony Edwards. And yeah, I obviously they've improved over the last couple of years. But this team went from middle of the pack defensively in 21-22 to 10th the next year, and number 1 last year. And the roster didn't change that dramatically outside of Rudy Gobert. Some of the fringe rotation guys, obviously Nickeil Alexander-Walker made a difference this year defensively. I get that. But like Rudy's first year, they completely changed the defensive scheme from a high variance, risky blitzing scheme that you try to speed the game up with Jared Vanderbilt to Patrick Beverley. They completely switch it to drop coverage, which they never played when they had Jared Vanderbilt at the 4 and Karl-Anthony Towns at the 5 and Patrick Beverley at the 1 and D'Angelo Russell on that team. They flipped to playing drop because of Rudy, and they improved the defense. And then this year, they were the best team in the league. And as we talked about ad nauseum on the show, one of the 2 times in the last 30 years that the best defensive team has had a 2.5 point or greater advantage over the second best defensive player of the year, or excuse me, second best team defense for the season. So no matter how you slice it, these comments are lazy, and guys just love piling on Rudy Gobert. And it's just at some point it's got to get old, right? Like, why are people so jealous that he's won 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards? He's been to the conference finals now twice. It's not like his teams haven't been successful. They haven't had consistent playoff success, but he's also never been considered the best player on any of those teams, right? There's Donovan Mitchell's failures, and, long list of all these other guys. And then the first time he gets past the first round with Minnesota, they go to the conference finals. I just don't understand. And I think the Olympics probably just kind of like fueled this fire a little bit in regard to Rudy, but and how people comment on him. It's just so crazy to me. It just not correct. I just don't know how so many guys in the league can just get this wrong. There's a reason why this dude's teams are always really good defensively. And it's not just because he's a big body. It's not just because he plays with athletic wings. It's so much more than that. It's the little stuff. It's the never minds that we talk about. And obviously Wembanyama took this to another level last spring with guys just not even, like fast breaks that were completely shut down because Wemby was back on defense. Like that direct impact right now versus 31-year-old Rudy Gobert is obviously greater for Wemby. But guys that won't even challenge Rudy Gobert in the paint. That happens all the time. Teams change what they're doing offensively because of Rudy's presence. And the Dallas matchup wasn't great. And the Timberwolves scheme wasn't great. They put him on an island too often, and Dallas did a good job of isolating against him on the perimeter. But Rudy does that still much better than really any 7-footer in the league. I'd put him up there with anybody of that size, height and weight, at least in position, in terms of defending on the perimeter. So there's a litany of reasons why the Timberwolves didn't make the finals, why the Mavs won in 5 games. But Dereck Lively and Dwight Howard are not on base with their comments of Rudy Gobert. That's an easy way that's the easy way to say it and sum it up. All right. I want to talk about the Tim Connelly interview that he did with Darren Wolfson. We'll get into a few different comments he made. I want to focus on some of the comments he made about the rest of the roster, the bench, the rotation. We'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. You've heard me talk a lot about FanDuel here at Locked On Wolves. It's because it's America's #1 sportsbook, and they have something a little bit different for you right now. Right now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with your YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel at any time. Again, now through September 22nd, all you have to do, this is any FanDuel customer, just bet $5, and you'll get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. And then if you have a base plan over at YouTube TV, you can watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. Just need a Google account and a current form of payment. You can cancel at any time. Visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. I know I will be watching NFL Sunday Ticket. I'll be on FanDuel as well. NFL football kicks off this week. Thursday night game, Friday night game. Of course, all the games Sunday, Monday night game. It's a big week. Check it all out over at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen of the day. Of course, for your second listen, you can enjoy the Locked On NBA podcast. There's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA. Available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so Tim Connelly, Timberwolves president of basketball operations, went on with Darren Wolfson of KSTP Channel 5 and Score North in the Twin Cities, had a long, wide-ranging conversation and some good comments in there. He talked a little bit about achieving some goals in the last year and understanding it's not a zero-sum game. Like obviously the ultimate goal is winning a championship, but they made progress and that does matter. He talks about the West being difficult. Talks a little bit about Rudy, the contract stuff. Well, actually, I'll talk a little more about that. Rookie talk. I want to get into some of what he said about the rookies. And then what he said about the backup point guard spot and also the 15th roster spot. So I want to get into all that here for the rest of the show. First, something we touched on, I think it was maybe not last week, but the week prior, the Rudy Gobert extension thing. If you haven't followed that, there hasn't been a lot about it in the news just because nothing's happened. But just a refresher, he is extension eligible and he can sign an extension at any point during the season. It's not like there's an October deadline like there is coming off of rookie contracts for rookie contract extensions. And he doesn't have to wait till the end of the season. Right now through next summer when he becomes when he could opt out and become a free agent, if he declines that player option, I think it's technically a player option, not an ETO, on his contract next summer, the Timberwolves could extend him. And as we've talked about before in the show, what makes the most sense is for the Wolves to buy out the last year of his current contract, pay him obviously overall more guaranteed money, but over a shorter period of time. Excuse me. Let me say that differently. overall more guaranteed money, but the average annual value would be lower. So instead of, let me put up quick. I think it's like 50 million for the year after this one. Instead of that, they could pay him less and get more years. So he's not just going to walk in 2 years. Yeah. So he's almost 44 million this year. The player option for 25-26 is a little under $47 million. More likely than not, Rudy, like, he'll be 33 going on 34. So could he opt out and get that much? Probably not. But could he opt out and get more years? Yeah. So, like, that's the leverage Rudy has is, look, you guys gave up all that stuff for me. I could play 3 years here and leave and get, it might be less money annually, but I'll get a contract somewhere else for 3-4 years, whatever. The Timberwolves, the incentive for them would be like, hey, let's save on the books in 25-26. Let's buy out that 47 million. And maybe we pay him. I'm just throwing numbers out there. Maybe we pay him 30 and then, 27 and 26, 27 and 22 or whatever. Maybe it's not actually a declining contract average annual value, but whatever it is, the average annual value would be less than what it currently is. And you get more years. And that helps as soon as 25-26. So no doubt that's what the Wolves want to do. And surely Rudy would be open to that. I would imagine. And so the quote from Tim Connelly, he said something to the effect of, we want Rudy to be here a long time. We love his agent, blah, blah, blah. Continuity is big. And, like, we want to keep most of our players, essentially, is what he said. So he's pretty vague about Gobert, which makes sense if they're in the process of negotiating something with him longer term. So I think that was, that answer makes a lot of sense, right? So we'll keep an eye on the Rudy stuff. I'd be a little surprised if something happens soon. I could be wrong. It could happen during the season. We'll see. I would think it's in Rudy's best interest to get it done sooner rather than later, in case he shows any signs of decline, in case there's any sort of injury this year. It would make a lot of sense for him to be, to be incentivized to get this thing done sooner rather than later. He talks a little bit about, Conley talks about Dillingham and Terrence Shannon. He's asked by Darren Wolfson how much they'll play. And he says they're going to have to prove that they've earned minutes, but we have an expensive team, so we're going to have spots for young guys. And he says they have to buy into Chris Finch's system. It's not always going to be pretty, but so, like, he says both things, right? Because you can't just say, yeah, we handed him a job, although they've kind of already alluded to Rob Dillingham playing a ton. But he says they have to earn it. Here's what they have to do to earn it, which is buy into the system, play hard, show progress, develop. But then he also says, like, they have to earn it. But we're an expensive team, so they need to play. So he definitely plays both sides of the coin, because it's obvious. Like, you look at the depth chart, you can't find a top 10 guy. You can't find a top 10 rotation without Dillingham or Shannon being part of it. And if you're talking 10 guys, Dillingham's absolutely part of it. And Shannon's, as we've talked about, kind of in that 9, 10, 11 spot, along with Joe Ingles and Josh Minott, most likely. He goes on to talk about how the work ethic's been great. They've had guys in the gym all summer and told guys to take a break here prior to training camp, but that there's been 11 or 12 guys in the gym all summer long. So, that's obviously positive. Tends to happen when you've got a younger team and also a team with really positive vibes surrounding it, and a young team that went to the conference finals. And, of course, they had, Rudy and Joe Ingles, Nickeil Alexander-Walker all played in the Olympics, so no doubt they took a little bit of time off here in between. But, I mean, we're like 3 weeks out from training camp, so these guys are going to have they're going to be right back in the gym. So for them to be there throughout the summer is great. I want to touch on the backup point guard thing and the 15th roster spot. I thought Tim Connelly had some pretty interesting answers to questions regarding those two topics. So we'll do that here next, and then we'll close out the show for today. All right, so Timberwolves president of basketball operations asked by Darren Wolfson of KSTP Channel 5 and Score North, who will fill the backup point guard position? I'm going to read here how it was transcribed over at Hoops Rumors. They said, this is Tim Connelly's answer to the question of who will fill the backup point guard position. Connelly says, quote, "It's up to Chris Finch. Certainly we think our guys are capable. PJ Dozier played full-time point last year in Europe. We drafted Dillingham to give him a real opportunity to earn minutes early on, and we're pretty confident he can do that. Again, nothing's given. I think the depth and the competitive nature of our depth is what helped us get through some tough times the last couple of years." end quote. Really interesting answer. Because he led with PJ Dozier, who I've not mentioned other than the day that the Timberwolves signed him to a partially guaranteed contract, in July. I don't think I've mentioned his name once. Like, he's number 14 on the depth chart right now. I thought that was pretty interesting. Clearly, he's a Tim Connelly favorite. He acquired him initially when he was with Denver. Had him last year in the Iowa Wolves, and now here he is on a partially guaranteed contract. I think it's guaranteed for $1 million, and there's a couple different layers there. I believe there's some sort of guarantee in the fall, and then another one, the typical kind of January timing of fully guaranteed for the rest of the year. I believe that's how his contract's structured. So I was really surprised to that he led with that. And who knows if this was just like, hey, we just talked a bunch about Dillingham. Like, I got to prove the point that we're not handing the backup point guard job to Rob Dillingham. But he didn't mention Nickeil Alexander-Walker. He didn't mention Anthony Edwards running the offense. He didn't mention Joe Ingles. Those are all players that I've talked about as like, hey, they're gonna be the guy. They're gonna initiate for this bench unit. And I still think that's true. I don't think there's any real possibility that PJ Dozier is the primary backup point guard. Like, that would be good for him if he has a fantastic camp and earns that job. But sitting here right now, he would be last on that list of options. And then I think as he went on, he mentions Dillingham, and then Conley goes on to talk about the depth and competitive nature of the depth, helping them get through tough times the last couple of years, which he's essentially bringing up the fact that there wasn't a true backup point guard. Like, obviously Jordan McLaughlin existed early last year, but there wasn't another guy other than Daishen Nix on a two-way deal. So, and he doesn't mention Nix either, by the way, who's back on a two-way deal, of course. When McLaughlin got hurt each of the last 2 years, they didn't bring in anyone else. And they acquired Monte Morris at the deadline last year, but there was never like a traditional, okay, here's your 14-minute, 6-7 minutes in each half, you're our backup point guard. Other than some stretches where it was McLaughlin or it was Monte Morris, it was kind of cobbled together, combination of those guys, Anthony Edwards running the unit, Kyle Anderson a lot of the time being the point forward for that second unit. So to bring up PJ Dozier, in my mind, this is like almost the Kyle Anderson role is what that would be. Now, let's not get this twisted. I don't think PJ Dozier's in this rotation. I really don't. I think this was a throwing him a bone because he's here. He's on the roster. He's a veteran. He's a favorite of Tim Connelly. And he's got a shot to play himself into a rotation spot because it's such a young roster. He's the only other veteran. If you want to call Luka Garza a veteran, fine, but he's like the fifth big. He's not going to be in the rotation. That's it. It's 7 of the top 8 from last year. It's Rob Dillingham. It's TJ Shannon. Joe Ingles is the only other veteran off the bench. Like, Nas is young, but he's obviously a veteran at this point. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker, I'd put them in the same boat. And then you have Dillingham and Shannon. And then Joe Ingles. That's it. It's Joe Ingles. And then it's Josh Mina, who's a third-year guy, and Leonard Miller, who's a second-year guy. Luka Garza, who's like a fourth-year guy at this point, but not significant minutes. There's nobody else. There's no other age to this roster. Of course, starters, Mike Conley, Rudy Gobert. Yeah. But that's it. There isn't the Monte Morris presence. There isn't a TJ Warren like there was on the roster at the end of last year. Their two-way guys are, Daishen Nix is a young guy. Jesse Edwards, young guy. Like, this is a young roster. PJ Dozier is the only other player, and it's not like PJ Dozier's old either. I mean, he's going to be 20? I guess he'll be 28 this year. But he's only played in 121 NBA games for his career. So it's not like he's bringing a wealth of experience to the NBA level. He has never played in more than 50 NBA games in a season. Of course, he got hurt back in Denver when he was kind of breaking out as a rotation type guy there. And that's the only time he's ever played in more than 29 NBA games, bouncing from OKC to Boston to Denver to Sacramento to overseas to the Iowa Wolves. He's not a legitimate rotation option, in my opinion, unless he has a crazy camp in preseason and the Wolves are just like completely beyond underwhelmed by their young players. I just thought that was such a weird and fascinating answer. So I guess something to keep an eye on is PJ Dozier running the second unit in training camp. The last question that I want to cover that Wolfson asked Tim Connelly was related to the 15th roster spot. Connelly said, quote, "We could," meaning fill the 15th roster spot. "There's some flexibility there. We want to be cognizant of where we are relative to the tax. We also want to be cognizant of where we are health-wise going into the season. Of course, we talked about if the right player is there, we would fill it. But at the moment, we're going to sit tight, see what September looks like. I think there will be another deal-making window, too, where maybe a guy shakes out that we didn't think would be available. That's exactly what I would expect him to say. The only thing I'd pull out of that is he says, at the moment, we're going to sit tight. I think there will be another deal-making window where maybe a guy shakes out we didn't think would be available. So they've undoubtedly got a short list of, like, everybody's seen the photos of, like, these front office guys in their office. They've got a board that's got every player on every roster in the league, and it's going to be marked as, like, guaranteed contracts or, like, pending free agents, restricted free agents next summer, two-way guys, rookies. Like, they've got color codes for everything. So no doubt they've got some guys, a handful of guys. I don't know if it's 5 guys or 10 guys or less, or maybe even more, that they think are maybe in danger of being cut or being had in a 2-for-1 deal or something. That's unlikely with the Wolves. Actually, the Wolves can't do that with their cap situation. But somebody who could be available, or as Conley says, shakes out to be available later in the offseason, even into training camp, into preseason. We occasionally see these players get released. Like, remember 2 years ago, the Wolves got Matt Ryan. It was actually after the season had started. He played with the Lakers for a little while. Last year, the Wolves let go of Matt Ryan during training camp, and he went to the Pelicans at the start of the season. So that type of a move is, if somebody, undoubtedly there's a handful of guys that they've got their eye on that they know, like, hey, if they hit the market, we're going to either claim them on waivers, which feels unlikely, or we'll pick them up if they hit free agency, if they clear waivers. But if that doesn't happen, the more likely scenario is that 15th roster spot stays open to give themselves some flexibility moving forward in case there's injuries. Like, say a big gets hurt, like, knock on wood, hopefully this doesn't happen, but Nas or Cat or Rudy, if one of those guys gets hurt, you need another big or somebody that can act as a big for a period of time. So that gives you some flexibility to fill out your roster in a different way. And then obviously every dollar is more expensive when you're over the second tax apron, like the Timberwolves are. They can only sign players as minimum salaries, at minimum salaries, I should say. So they're clearly limited there as well. So exactly the answer I'd expect from Tim Connelly, but clearly something to keep an eye on here moving forward. All right. That's all we have for you today on the show. Of course, we'll be back on Friday. We're still doing 3 shows a week. We'll do 3 shows next week. And then I think the following week, we'll be back to 5 shows, getting you ready for training camp. We'll do a bunch of season preview stuff. We'll talk about the preseason schedule. Lots to get to here in the coming weeks. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can also follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Now, go check out the Locked On NBA podcast, where the season never ends, providing national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked On NBA in the description of this show, so you don't need to go search for it. Of course, that's also part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.